There's a lot of anecdotal advice around on improving your marriage. But if you want something you can really use that will actually make a difference and reignite your marriage, check out the link in the description below.
The question: my husband of 30 years has cheated on me and abused me. Should I honestly move on? Answer by Mexico Vane. We're still together after 35 years because I refuse to ever consider splitting up, although Matt's been unfaithful to me for most of that time. We met at university and has all the classic things: tall, good-looking, brigh, funny. Very few women can resist him. In not excusing him, as the pain has caused me is immeasurable, but he was sent to boarding school aged 8, and from a very early age the only person he could depend on was himself. Try this. This is how I saved my marriage. Pete Manoy Medium. I watched as Matt broke one heart after another, always warning them they'll never settle down, in really bad luck, but they were all willing to give it a try. He was from a very army family and I knew that I was the right sort of girl for him, so I played it very cool, which he wasn't used to. It took all my willpower not to fall into his bed, but I finally agreed to dinner and an old-fashioned courtship. We got engaged on my 22nd birthday. I managed to keep his hands off me until our wedding was booked, and by the time I was pregnant with our elder son Tom 3 years later, I was sure Matt was tamed. He worked hard, earned a lot, and we both loved socializing. I'm a teacher, and when we had the big chat about childcare I happily agreed to give up work. We didn't plan on having Simon quite so quickly, and having 2 children under 2 was as tiring as everyone says it is, but I was proud of myself getting fit really quickly, looking good and always ready to jump into bed with Matt when the babies were sleeping. Simon was cranky and I sat up half the night with him, going over everything in my head. I felt sick and full of rage. I wanted to pull Matt out of our bed and scream at him, but I knew that if I did, there was no going back. Even if we didn't SPL it up, there would be terrible rows and our lovely, happy life would be disrupted. I had no idea how long they had been seeing each other, but by morning I was sure of only 2 things: we were staying married, and from now on I would know everything. I was pretty sure Chloe would be history soon, but I was always watching, wondering who was his latest conquest. I was convinced that if I said nothing, he would never leave me for anyone. He loved me and the boys, he loved our lifestyle, and his good name was very important to him. No way he'd give all that up for a fleeting affair. It wasn't easy and it was tiring being on full alert. I remember at a PTA wine tasting watching Matt talking to another mom, who was about 7 months pregnant. I was actually relaxing and thinking that surely someone like that was safe, but then Matt slipped his hand up the back of her maternity blouse and round to cup her breast for a second. She beamed at him, while I stood in horror wondering if it was his baby she was carrying. That was 20 years ago, and I think he stopped seeing other women about 5 years ago, when we both reached 50 and our first grandchild was born. Answer by Sherry Kogan. Do you have any reason to believe that in 10 years he will be less abusive or more faithful? If not, then do you think that in 10 years' time it will be easier to leave him? You're either staying because you're procrastinating, or you're staying because you are holding on to the belief that improvement is possible. If the latter, is that based on concrete evidence or wishful thinking? There's an element of complacency, adjustment and acceptance of infidelity and abuse that takes place over time. Unless these behaviors have only recently surfaced, you have been living with this for quite some time. If that's the case, what will mobilize you to take action? Knowledge of the steps to take to extricate yourself? Resources? Courage to face possible wrath? The belief that life apart can actually be better than together? No one can tell you that life on your own will be any better. You may or may not meet someone. The question is, would you be happier apart than together? The decision to divorce, I think, is very often made when the thought of being on one's own is less unpalatable than the thought of continuing to share one's life with the other person. Answer by Cephas Ruka. This is an interesting question, because you don't indicate how long the situation has existed. On the one hand, if you have been putting up with this for a long time, it seems clear that at the very least you need to get out and see if Tyrese anyway. You can jolt the man back to his senses. On the other hand, if it's only just started, and the rest of your marriage has been good, and the abuse is verbal not physical, sticking it out, with help and oversight of course, might be a worthwhile idea. Having lived through a marriage that ended in unfaithfulness and mental, emotional abuse of a moderate level, the abuse existed off and on for many years. I have some understanding of similar situations. I have found that people often react quickly and rashly in giving advice to others experiencing such a situation, especially when it's a woman. I'm not at all advocating that you stay in a place where you are suffering prolonged injury of any kind, nor that you should just accept what's happening. But, And Tyrese always say but, if this situation has only recently developed, there may still be a chance to save the marriage. You've come here asking a question, which indicates that you're not sure, which tells me that possibly you still love your husband enough to want to try to sort things out. Which is a good thing, as too many people bail once the going gets tough, and even heard of many instances of marriages being saved where the wife or husband is willing to forgive the other, get help, work through reconciliation, and things are better than ever after it all. It's been my experience that too many people in this world don't really take marriage seriously. Many people don't realize that the intent of marriage was for a couple to stay together for the rest of their lives, to stick with each other and work through problems. Marriage is the elding, joining together, of the heart, soul and mind of two human beings. Not a trivial matter at all. Do I think a person should become a doormat for the other in a marriage? Most certainly not. All marriages have the potential to reach a place where they are no longer salvageable. Although the situation I experienced is unlikely to be as serious as the one you may be in, please allow me to share. My second wife and I reached a point after being together for about 13 years, 3 of those married under the same roof, where the love evaporated from the marriage to a large degree, taking with it most physical and emotional intimacy. She was going through a period of intense introspection, and she refused outside help that got her chasing her tail emotionally and psychologically over past unsolved dramas and life decisions. At the end of 2 years of this, during which her abuse to me was locking me out of her life in large measure and the accompanying cold violence that periodically accompanied that, she came to the conclusion that she wanted to leave me and find someone more suitable. Much earlier in our relationship, I had been subject to intense grilling and forced behavioral changes due to errors I had made, or been perceived to make, from a time 7 years prior to that when we had been together for a year. That's a very long story. Suffice it to say that her behavior during our whole 15 years together, excluding the year we spent together then separate, amounted to varying forms of brainwashing in order to make me compliant and mold me into the man she wanted. I only realized in the last couple of years the depth of that brainwashing, and how much he altered my personality in ways that were quite unhealthy. So, abuse comes in many, subtle forms, but their long-term effects can be just as adverse as the more obvious physical, mental and emotional abuse that get all the attention. Anyway, rather than just end our marriage and walk away, she proceeded to sneakily start having an affair with a man she had had her eye on for many years, and who still had a thing for her. It's unfortunate for her that she married someone in IT who was able to do a bit of sniffing around and discover her secret Hotmail address and see what she was saying to her lover. Where I'm going with all this is that the shock and humiliation and damage to my self-esteem altered my personality radically. However, I did not give up on the marriage right away, and spent several months trying to convince her to give up the affair and change her mind. No, I didn't use any abuse myself, although my entreaties were often accompanied by some tears. I even let her stay in the house and use my money to live during the time she was having the affair, so that she could see I was serious about trying to keep her. In the end, I reached a point where I could see that it was obvious that her mind was made up and her course set, so we split up and eventually went through divorce. Fortunately, we were both reasonably mature about the whole thing, and as a result the splitting up of assets and such went quite well with minimal drama. I share all this just by way of example that it is possible to save a marriage if both parties want it, although in this instance I was unsuccessful because she didn't want it. Even if one does and the other doesn't, it's still possible with a bit of work, and a lot of prayer, to win the offending party back, if one wants it enough. Again, in my case, she just wasn't interested, but my point is that I didn't just give up on her, even though I had every excuse and reason to do so. Am I a saint? Hardly. But I still gave it a go despite many times thinking I should just end this right now. I don't believe in giving up easily. My advice to you is to take stock of your situation. Do you still deeply love the man who is your husband, despite the shock and humiliation you've suffered? Do you believe that underneath his current behavior is still the man you fell in love with so long ago and married? Is there a true spark of hope within you that stubbornly believes things are salvageable given the right attitude from your husband? Are you the sort of person who stays committed to a person to the last minute as a way of honoring the relationship? As I said earlier, I'm not at all suggesting you stay in a place that is unhealthy for you, especially if the abuse is noteworthy, and only you can ultimately be the judge of how bad the abuse is on your own moral scale. But I am saying if there is any reasonable hope that things could be fixed, even if the process would be a little difficult, please consider that option. Also, get people involved in your thinking process who you trust. It can be very valuable having outside perspectives when you can't see the forest for the trees. Finally, if you're only staying in the marriage for the kids or to keep up appearances, get out. The marriage is already dead in that case. The only reason to stay in the marriage is if you still have true, genuine love for your husband, even if that love is hurting and grieving at the moment.